Mary Lou Jenkins delivered twin boys in a lean-to shed behind her cabin near Yellville, Arkansas, on October 14, 1866. Both infants bore the twisted limbs and enlarged skulls common to the Jenkins bloodline. 3 generations of cousin marriages had left their mark in club feet and split palates that ran through the family like water through cracked stone. Tell us your city and the exact time on your clock right now. How many witnesses saw her choose which twin would live and which would burn? Dr. Ezekiel Hartwell arrived at the Jenkins property on October 17th, carrying his leather medical bag and a stomach full of dread. The message delivered by young Timothy Brooke had been simple. Come quick. Mary Lou done something terrible to one of them babies. Hartwell had delivered difficult births before, but nothing had prepared him for what he found in that shed. The smell of burnt pork fat mixed with coarse salt still lingered in the cramped space. Mary Lou sat in the corner holding one surviving infant, her eyes fixed on a spot 6 inches above the doctor's head. The baby in her arms wheezed through a cleft palate, its tiny chest rising and falling in irregular patterns. On the dirt floor, 17 wooden slats formed a crude circle around a blackened depression. She said it would purify the bloodline, whispered Constance Brooke, Timothy's mother, who had been first to hear the screaming. Said the Lord told her one had to go back to the fire so the other could be clean. Hartwell counted 7 iron nails driven into the shed's walls, each one blackened at the tip. A hemp rope hung from the center beam, cut short at exactly 4 feet from the floor. The air held traces of something beyond smoke and salt, a sweetness that made his throat close. The Jenkins family had settled the hollow 3 miles east of Yellville in 1847. Josiah Jenkins married his first cousin Rebecca in 1849, producing 5 children before Rebecca died in childbirth, attempting a 6th. Their eldest son, Thomas, married Rebecca's sister Martha in 1854. Mary Lou was their daughter, born in 1845, with a withered left hand and eyes that never quite focused on the same point. Thomas Jenkins had taken his own daughter as wife in 1863. No preacher would perform the ceremony, so Thomas declared himself wed to Mary Lou by common law. The neighbors knew, Sheriff Coleman knew, Judge Weatherby knew. None of them rode the 3 miles to stop it. Mary Lou's first pregnancy ended in miscarriage during the winter of 1864. The second produced a stillborn girl in spring of 1865. Local midwife Hannah Pruitt remembered the girl's face. Looked like somebody had squeezed clay too hard before it set. Eyes on the sides of her head like a fish. The twin birth on October 14, 1866, lasted 14 hours. Hannah Pruitt assisted, along with Constance Brooke and Mary Lou's cousin Aunt Martha. The first twin emerged feet first with clubbed extremities, and a cleft that split his face from lip to forehead. The second twin followed 30 minutes later, bearing identical deformities but crying stronger. Mary Lou took one look at both babies and started laughing. Constance Brooke later told Dr. Hartwell, not the good kind of laughing, the kind that makes your spine feel cold. She picked up the weaker one and said, "This one goes to God, this one stays with me." Hannah Pruitt tried to intervene. Mary Lou struck her across the face with a wooden ladle, opening a cut that required 6 stitches. Martha Jenkins fled the shed. Only Constance remained, too frightened to move or speak. Mary Lou built her fire using split pine kindling and pig fat scraped from a ceramic jar. She added 3 handfuls of coarse salt, muttering words that sounded like prayer, but contained no phrases Constance recognized. The flames rose to waist height within minutes. She held that baby like it was an offering, Constance whispered to her husband later that night. Kept saying, take the bad one, leave the good one, over and over until the words didn't sound like words anymore. The infant's cries lasted less than 2 minutes. Mary Lou used the wooden tongs to arrange the small body within the flames, adjusting the limbs with careful precision. The smell of burnt pork fat mixed with coarse salt filled the shed as sparks rose through gaps in the plank ceiling. When Sheriff Coleman arrived 3 days later, Mary Lou was nursing the surviving twin and humming a tune no one could identify. The circular arrangement of 17 wooden slats remained undisturbed around the blackened fire pit. She offered no resistance when Coleman placed her under arrest. The trial convened in Judge Weatherby's chambers on November 2, 1866. Mary Lou entered wearing a clean blue dress and carrying the surviving infant. She spoke only once during the 2-hour proceeding. I'd done what needed doing. God told me which one to keep. Dr. Hartwell testified about the shed's condition and the evidence of deliberate burning. Hannah Pruitt described the birth and Mary Lou's actions immediately afterward. Constance Brooke recounted the words she heard in the careful way. Mary Lou had arranged the fire. The defense consisted of Thomas Jenkins standing to declare his wife's innocence. She ain't right in the head, he told the judge. Never has been since she was small. Don't know good from bad most times. Judge Weatherby reviewed the testimony for 11 minutes. Arkansas law in 1866 required proof of premeditation for murder. Charges: The careful arrangement of the fire pit, the prepared kindling, and the repeated statements about purification provided that proof. Mary Lou Jenkins, you are sentenced to hang by the neck until dead for the willful murder of an infant child. Sentenced to be carried out December 1st, 1866 at noon. The execution took place in Yellville's town square before 47 witnesses. Mary Lou wore the same blue dress and carried a letter written in her own hand. The letter contained 17 words. The fire cleaned the blood. The good one will live. The Lord showed me which was which. She dropped from the gallows at 12 minutes past noon. Dr. Hartwell pronounced her dead at 12:15. The surviving twin, renamed Joseph by county officials, was placed with a family in Little Rock who specialized in caring for disabled children. But the story didn't end with Mary Lou's execution. Thomas Jenkins vanished from his property 2 weeks later, leaving behind debts and a cabin filled with papers. Those papers, discovered by creditors in January 1867, revealed a pattern of correspondence dating back 15 years. Letters addressed to Jenkins bore postmarks from counties across Arkansas and Tennessee. The writers shared common themes: bloodline purity, sacred fire, and the need to cull the weak branches. One letter from Polk County, Tennessee, contained a detailed diagram matching the 17-slat arrangement found in Mary Lou's shed. The circle must be complete before the cleansing can begin, read a passage written in careful script. Salt preserves the body. Fire purifies the soul. The chosen child carries forward what is best in the blood. Another letter, postmarked from Hot Springs in 1863, included specific instructions for timing the ritual. Wait until the weak twin shows signs of failing. The contrast will be clear to God's eye. He will guide your hand to the correct choice. The correspondence revealed a network of families practicing similar rituals across isolated mountain communities. Names appeared repeatedly: Caldwell, Morrison, Wickham, Patterson. All bore the surnames of established bloodlines known for intermarriage and physical deformities. County records from Hot Springs showed 3 infant deaths in 1864, all attributed to natural causes, despite suspicious circumstances. 2 died in house fires. One disappeared from its crib, leaving behind only a small pile of salt and pig fat. Similar patterns emerged in Polk County, Tennessee, and Jackson County, Alabama. Isolated families, deformed children, mysterious fires, always the salt and pig fat, always the careful arrangement of wooden slats. Dr. Hartwell continued investigating these connections until his death in 1889. His personal notes, discovered in his medical bag, contained maps marking locations of suspected rituals across 4 states. Each site bore identical characteristics: remote hollows, inbred families, and missing children explained away as stillbirths or natural deaths. The surviving twin, Joseph, lived until age 12 in the Little Rock Care Facility. Staff members noted his exceptional intelligence despite his physical limitations. He spoke frequently about dreams involving fire and the smell of burnt pork fat mixed with coarse salt. Joseph died of pneumonia in January 1879. His death certificate listed no next of kin, but a package arrived at the care facility 2 days after his funeral. Inside, 17 wooden slats, each one bearing a small burn mark. No return address. No accompanying letter. The postmark read, Yellville, Arkansas. Fun! The facility director, Miss Sarah Campbell, burned the wooden slats in the kitchen stove, but she kept detailed records of their dimensions and markings in her personal journal. Those measurements matched exactly the 17 slats found in Mary Lou Jenkins' shed 13 years earlier. Modern researchers attempting to verify these records face immediate obstacles. The Yellville courthouse burned in 1923, destroying most documents from the 1860s. The Little Rock Care Facility closed in 1885. Its records transferred to state archives that suffered water damage in 1891. However, certain evidence persists in unexpected places. The Arkansas State Medical Board maintains Dr. Hartwell's license application from 1858, which includes detailed anatomical drawings of deformed infants consistent with inbreeding effects. His sketches show club feet, cleft palates, and enlarged craniums matching descriptions from the Jenkins case. The Hot Springs County Historical Society houses a collection of 19th century letters donated by various families. Among these, 3 pieces of correspondence bearing the surnames Caldwell and Morrison, containing references to cleansing fires and blood purity. The letters are cataloged as family genealogy materials, with no mention of their ritualistic content. Physical evidence survived in one location. The foundation stones of Mary Lou Jenkins' cabin remained visible until 1987, when a housing development covered the site. But construction workers reported finding a circular arrangement of charred wood buried 18 inches below ground level. The wood fragments measured exactly 17 pieces, each bearing identical burn patterns. Those fragments were sent to the University of Arkansas Archaeology Department for analysis. Carbon dating confirmed the wood originated in the 1860s. Chemical analysis detected traces of sodium chloride, salt, and animal fat consistent with pig rendering. The burn patterns suggested intense, controlled heat rather than accidental fire damage. The surviving documentation paints a picture of organized ritualistic practice spanning multiple generations and geographic regions. Families, isolated by geography and blood relation, developed similar methods for addressing genetic deformities through infanticide, disguised as religious ceremony. The salt served a practical purpose, preserving the body during burning to extend suffering and ensure complete consumption by fire. The pig fat provided accelerant for reliable ignition. The 17 wooden slats created a sacred space that participants believed would sanctify the murder as divine will. Mary Lou Jenkins was not an isolated case of maternal madness. She was part of a distributed network of inbred families who had developed systematic methods for eliminating children they viewed as genetically inferior. The letters discovered after her execution proved coordination and shared methodology across hundreds of miles. But how many other families practiced these rituals without leaving evidence? How many isolated hollows harbored similar secrets? The correspondence hints at practices extending back decades before Mary Lou's case brought official attention. The Arkansas State Archives contain birth and death records showing suspicious patterns in remote counties, high rates of stillbirth, frequent infant deaths from natural causes, and unusual numbers of single-child families in areas where large families were the norm. These patterns persist into the 1880s, suggesting that IE's network survived Mary Lou's execution and continued operating. Only improved transportation and communication gradually brought isolated communities under outside scrutiny, making such practices more difficult to conceal. Joseph Jenkins' death in 1879 marked the end of direct evidence from the original case. But the package of 17 wooden slats delivered after his funeral suggested someone had maintained interest in his fate for 13 years. Someone who knew the exact specifications of his mother's ritual circle. Who sent those slats? How? Did they know Joseph's location at the Little Rock facility? Why wait until after his death to make contact? The postmark from Yellville indicated local knowledge and ongoing presence in the area where Mary Lou had performed her ritual. The timing suggests a belief system where the surviving twin carried spiritual significance beyond his natural lifetime. Perhaps his death triggered some form of ceremonial closure. Perhaps the wooden slats represented completion of a ritual cycle begun in 1866. The care facility's decision to burn the slats eliminated potential evidence, but reflected contemporary understanding of their significance. Ms. Campbell's journal entry noted, "Items appeared to carry malevolent influence, destruction deemed necessary for safety of remaining children." Her use of the word malevolent indicates she suspected the slats represented more than simple correspondence. Her immediate impulse to destroy them suggests recognition of their ritualistic nature. The fact that she preserved detailed measurements in her journal proves she understood their evidentiary value, despite choosing elimination over preservation. Modern law enforcement would handle such evidence differently, but 1879 Arkansas lacked systems for investigating distributed criminal networks. Individual cases were processed locally without coordination between jurisdictions. Patterns spanning multiple counties and states remained invisible to authorities, operating with limited communication and transportation. The correspondence discovered in Thomas Jenkins' abandoned cabin represented the most comprehensive evidence of the network's scope and methodology. But county officials in 1867 lacked resources for interstate investigation. The letters were cataloged as estate property and eventually distributed among creditors without forensic analysis. Some correspondence may survive in private collections or regional historical societies, misfiled as genealogical materials or family history documentation. The ritualistic references would appear cryptic to casual readers, but might yield significant information under systematic analysis. The Hot Springs County Historical Society's letters suggest at least 3 families maintained active correspondence about ritual practices. Genealogical research could identify descendant families and trace bloodlines forward to the present day. But would modern descendants recognize their ancestors' involvement in ritualistic infanticide? Family histories tend to sanitize uncomfortable truths. Stories of weak babies who died young might conceal deliberate killings. References to religious ceremonies might camouflage murder. The network's geographic distribution suggests coordination through established communication routes, river transport, trade paths, and kinship connections. Families living in isolation still maintained contact with distant relatives through letters and occasional visits. This communication enabled sharing of ritualistic techniques and mutual support for practices that might otherwise seem unthinkably aberrant. Isolation breeds extremism, but coordination makes extreme practices seem normal within the participating community. Mary Lou Jenkins didn't invent the ritual she performed in that shed. She learned it from correspondence with other families practicing identical ceremonies. The 17 wooden slats, the salt and pig fat, the careful selection process, all represented refined methodology developed through repeated practice. The precision of her actions during the twin birth suggests prior preparation and possibly previous experience. While no evidence indicates Mary Lou had performed the ritual before, her familiarity with the process implies extensive mental rehearsal or direct instruction from someone with practical knowledge. Thomas Jenkins's involvement remains unclear, but significant. Did he participate in planning the ritual? Did he connect Mary Lou with the correspondence network? His sudden disappearance after her execution suggests guilty knowledge and fear of prosecution. The letters found in his cabin were addressed to him personally, indicating his role as primary correspondent with other families. Mary Lou's limited literacy makes it unlikely she maintained the extensive letter-writing documented in those papers. Thomas Jenkins served as network coordinator, receiving information from distant families and presumably sharing their techniques. With Mary Lou, his flight after her execution protected the broader network but eliminated the best source of information about its organization and membership. His fate remains unknown. No records exist of Thomas Jenkins' death or subsequent residence. He vanished completely from official documentation after January 1867, when creditors discovered his abandoned property. Did he relocate to another state and continue the practices under a new identity? Did other network members provide sanctuary and false documentation? Or did guilt and fear drive him to suicide in some remote location where his body was never discovered? The network's survival without Thomas Jenkins suggests distributed leadership rather than centralized control. Other families maintained the correspondence and continued ritual practices despite losing their Arkansas coordinator. Evidence from Hot Springs, Polk County, and Jackson County indicates activity continuing into the 1880s. The practices adapted to changing circumstances but retained core elements: salt, pig fat, wooden slat arrangements, and careful selection of victims from twin births. Law enforcement eventually developed sufficient communication and coordination to disrupt such networks. Interstate correspondence became easier to monitor. Improved transportation allowed faster response to suspected crimes. Medical knowledge advanced to the point where ritualistic explanations for infant death became less credible. But the transition took decades. Isolated communities maintained traditional practices well into the 20th century, protected by geographic barriers and cultural isolation. Some rituals may have continued in modified forms, adapted to avoid official attention while preserving essential elements. The 17 wooden slats sent to Joseph Jenkins' care facility in 1879 prove the network maintained operational capability. 13 years after Mary Lou's execution, someone tracked the surviving twin's location and observed his death closely enough to time the package delivery precisely. This level of coordination requires sustained organization and dedicated membership. The ritual wasn't simply eliminated by executing one practitioner. It survived through distributed knowledge and continued commitment from multiple families across multiple states. How many other surviving twins were tracked through their lifetimes? How many received similar packages upon their deaths? The care facility's records might contain additional examples, but water damage in 1891 eliminated most documentation from that period. Medical facilities caring for disabled children in the 1870s and 1880s might have received similar packages without understanding their significance. Staff members might have discarded mysterious wooden items without recording their receipt or characteristics. The practice of sending wooden slats to surviving twins suggests a belief system, where the ritual's completion required acknowledgement of the survivor's eventual death. Perhaps practitioners believed the fire's purification remained incomplete while the selected twin lived. This theology implies long-term commitment extending far beyond the immediate infanticide. Network members invested years or decades monitoring survivors, waiting for natural death to trigger final ceremonial closure. Such dedication indicates religious conviction rather than mere convenience killing. The practitioners genuinely believed their actions served divine purpose and required proper completion according to established ritual protocols. The salt and pig fat served symbolic as well as practical functions. Salt preservation and fat. Combustion created sensory experiences that reinforced the ritual's sacred nature. The smell of burnt pork fat mixed with coarse salt became a signature element connecting practitioners across geographic distances. Joseph Jenkins reported dreams about fire and specific odors suggest traumatic memory retention from his birth experience. While only 2 days old during the ritual, he may have retained subconscious impressions that surfaced in sleep throughout his childhood. His exceptional intelligence, noted by care facility staff, contradicts expectations for severely inbred children. Perhaps the ritual's psychological trauma stimulated cognitive development as a survival mechanism. Or perhaps Mary Lou's selection process correctly identified the healthier twin, despite both showing obvious deformities. The network's belief in bloodline purification through selective killing contained a grain of genetic truth. Eliminating the weaker twin might theoretically improve survival prospects for the stronger, but the ritualistic framework disguised what was essentially eugenic selection as divine intervention. Modern genetics would classify the Jenkins family practices as a primitive form of artificial selection applied to human reproduction. The results, eliminating obviously defective offspring while preserving those with better survival potential, align with evolutionary principles, despite the supernatural justification. But the cost in human suffering makes such practices morally indefensible regardless of their theoretical genetic benefits. The ritualistic burning inflicted maximum pain on helpless victims, while providing psychological satisfaction for perpetrators convinced of their righteous purpose. The network's correspondence reveals awareness of genetic concepts disguised as religious language. References to bloodline purity and culling weak branches demonstrate understanding of hereditary principles within a theological framework that justified infanticide as divine will. This combination of primitive genetics and religious extremism created a belief system capable of sustaining organized child murder across multiple generations and geographic regions. Practitioners convinced themselves they were serving God while eliminating genetically inferior offspring. The 17 wooden slats held specific significance within this belief system. The number 17 appears repeatedly in network correspondence, always associated with ritual arrangements and ceremonial requirements. Numerological significance in religious practices often derives from scriptural references or traditional symbolism. 17 combines the completeness of 16, 4 squared, with the beginning of a new cycle. In the network's theology, 17 may have represented perfection plus divine intervention. The precise arrangement of slats in a circle created sacred space where normal moral constraints were suspended. Inside that circle, infanticide became sacrifice. Murder became mercy. Genetic selection became divine guidance. The psychological power of ritual boundaries cannot be underestimated. Ordinary individuals become capable of extreme actions when convinced they are operating within divinely sanctioned parameters. The wooden slats provided those parameters for network practitioners. Mary Lou Jenkins was not insane in any medical sense. She was indoctrinated into a belief system that made her actions seem not only reasonable but morally required. Her calm demeanor during arrest and trial reflects genuine conviction rather than mental illness. The network succeeded in recruiting and maintaining members across decades and hundreds of miles. By providing religious justification for practices that served practical genetic purposes, families struggling with hereditary deformities found theological framework for eliminating unwanted offspring. But the system required ongoing reinforcement through correspondence and shared ritual elements. Isolated practitioners might lose conviction without community support. The letters provided that support by normalizing extreme practices within a distributed religious community. The network's eventual decline resulted from external pressure rather than internal collapse. Improved transportation and communication made isolated communities less isolated. Law enforcement developed better coordination between jurisdictions. Medical knowledge advanced to the point where ritualistic explanations became less credible. Social changes also reduced tolerance for extreme religious practices. As mainstream society became more secular, theological justifications for infanticide lost persuasive power even in isolated communities. But traces of the network's influence may persist in family traditions and regional folklore. Stories about blessed children and divine selection might preserve sanitized versions of ritualistic practices. References to salt, fire, and purification in local legends could derive from actual historical events. Contemporary researchers investigating 19th century infant mortality patterns might discover additional evidence of network activity. Statistical analysis of birth and death records could reveal geographic clusters suggesting coordinated practice rather than random occurrence. Genealogical databases now make it possible to trace bloodlines across multiple generations and geographic locations. Families with histories of consanguineous marriage and infant mortality might yield evidence of network participation. DNA analysis of remains found at suspected ritual sites could confirm genetic relationships and provide evidence of deliberate selection based on hereditary factors. Modern forensic techniques might extract information from evidence that 19th century investigators lacked the technology to analyze. But such research would require careful ethical consideration. Descendant. Families might face social consequences from revelations about ancestral practices. Communities might prefer to leave disturbing historical truths undiscovered. The balance between historical accuracy and social sensitivity becomes particularly delicate when investigating crimes against children. Academic interest and understanding. Past practices must be weighed against potential harm to living individuals whose ancestors participated in those practices. Mary Lou Jenkins' story represents more than individual madness or isolated criminal behavior. It exemplifies systematic practices that persisted across generations, families, and states. The ritual burning of her infant son was part of a distributed network engaging in coordinated genetic selection disguised as religious ceremony. The 17 wooden slats found in that shed weren't random artifacts. They were ritual tools, refined through years of practice and shared among families convinced of their divine mission. The salt and pig fat weren't improvised materials. They were traditional elements with symbolic significance and practical effectiveness. The correspondence discovered after Mary Lou's execution proves this wasn't unique behavior, but part of established tradition maintained through active communication among geographically dispersed practitioners. The network provided theological framework, practical instruction, and psychological support for practices that would otherwise seem unthinkably extreme. Joseph Jenkins' survival until age 12 allowed network members to monitor the ritual's outcome and confirm their selection process. His exceptional intelligence, despite severe physical deformities, validated their belief in successful bloodline purification through selective killing. The package of 17 wooden slats delivered after Joseph's death completed the ceremonial cycle begun 13 years earlier in that Arkansas shed. Someone maintained interest in his fate throughout his lifetime, waiting for natural death to trigger final ritual acknowledgement. Current medical understanding of genetic disorders makes the network's practices seem primitive and cruel. But 19th century families dealing with hereditary deformities lacked scientific framework for understanding their situation. Religious explanation filled that gap, providing meaning and method for addressing genetic problems. The network's correspondence reveals sophisticated understanding of hereditary principles disguised as theological language. Practitioners recognized genetic patterns and developed systematic approaches for addressing them within religious framework that justified extreme measures. Modern genetics confirms some network beliefs while condemning their methods. Eliminating genetically defective offspring could theoretically improve bloodline health, but ethical principles prohibit such practices regardless of their theoretical benefits. The transition from religious to scientific understanding eliminated theological justification for ritualistic infanticide, but genetic concerns persist in modern contexts. Prenatal testing, selective abortion, genetic counseling, and reproductive technology all address similar issues through medically accepted methods. Mary Lou Jenkins chose fire and salt where contemporary parents might choose clinical termination. The difference lies not in underlying genetic concerns, but in available methods and social acceptance. Both approaches seek to prevent hereditary suffering through selective elimination of affected offspring. The network's ritual framework provided psychological comfort for practitioners engaged in infanticide. Religious ceremony transformed murder into sacrifice, genetic selection into divine guidance. The elaborate protocols gave meaning to actions that might otherwise generate unbearable guilt. Contemporary medical procedures achieve similar results through clinical protocols that provide psychological distance from the reality of selective elimination. Technological sophistication disguises genetic selection as medical care, making morally complex decisions seem routine and medically necessary. The 17 wooden slats represented more than ritual tools. They symbolized community standards, shared beliefs, and collective responsibility for genetic outcomes. Network members participated in distributed decision-making process that reduced individual guilt through group participation. Modern genetic counseling achieves similar psychological benefits through professional guidance and medical authority. Individual parents receive expert advice that shifts responsibility from personal choice to professional recommendation. The decision-making process is sanitized through clinical language and technological mediation, but fundamental questions remain unchanged. Who decides which genetic variations are acceptable? What level of suffering justifies prevention through selective elimination? How do societies balance individual rights against collective genetic health? Mary Lou Jenkins answered those questions through fire and salt. Contemporary societies answer them through prenatal testing and clinical procedures. The methods differ dramatically, but the underlying genetic concerns persist across centuries of medical and technological advancement. The network's correspondence reveals sophisticated understanding of these moral complexities. Practitioners wrestled with ethical implications and developed theological framework for justifying extreme practices. Their letters show genuine concern for genetic health combined with recognition of moral costs. Religious justification provided framework for accepting those costs as necessary for greater good. Divine command sanctified infanticide as sacrifice. Genetic improvement became spiritual purification. Individual suffering served collective benefit. Contemporary bioethics addresses similar moral complexities through secular philosophical framework. Professional medical ethics replace theological justification, but fundamental questions about selective elimination remain contested across religious, cultural, and philosophical boundaries. The network's eventual collapse resulted from changing social conditions rather than internal moral recognition. Practitioners maintained religious conviction, while external pressure made their practices impossible to continue. They never abandoned theological beliefs that justified ritualistic infanticide. This historical pattern suggests that extreme practices require external intervention rather than internal reform. Religious communities convinced of divine mandate may persist in harmful behaviors until outside forces compel change through legal, social, or economic pressure. The 17 wooden slats sent to Joseph Jenkins' care facility in 1879 prove network commitment survived decades beyond Mary Lou's execution. Someone maintained ritual obligations, despite knowing the practices had become socially unacceptable and legally dangerous. Such dedication indicates genuine religious conviction. Rather than mere convenience or tradition, network members believed their practices served divine purpose that transcended contemporary legal and social constraints. External prohibition strengthened rather than weakened their sense of righteous persecution. Religious extremism often intensifies under external pressure, transforming opposition into confirmation of divine truth. The network's survival through law enforcement crackdowns validates this psychological pattern. Persecution confirmed practitioners' sense of special divine mission. But geographic isolation that originally protected the network eventually contributed to its decline. Improved transportation and communication made isolated communities less isolated. Outside contact introduced alternative perspectives that undermined exclusive theological frameworks. The network required separation from mainstream society to maintain extreme beliefs and practices. Increased social integration exposed practitioners to moral arguments and legal consequences that made ritualistic infanticide unsustainable. Modern religious extremism faces similar challenges from global communication and social media. Isolated communities find it increasingly difficult to maintain exclusive belief systems when external information becomes easily accessible. But technology also enables virtual isolation through selective information consumption. Online communities can reinforce extreme beliefs without geographic separation. Digital communication allows coordinated practices across vast distances. The 19th century network used letters to maintain connection among geographically dispersed practitioners. Contemporary extremist groups use internet communication to achieve similar coordination with greater efficiency and security. Fundamental patterns persist across technological changes. Isolated communities develop extreme practices, religious justification overcomes moral constraints, distributed networks provide mutual support and practical instruction. Mary Lou Jenkins' story illuminates these patterns through specific historical example. The ritual burning of her infant son represents systematic practice rather than individual aberration. The network's correspondence proves coordinated activity across multiple families and states. The 17 wooden slats found in that Arkansas shed weren't unique artifacts. They were standard ritual tools used by network practitioners, following shared protocols developed through years of experience and correspondence. The salt and pig fat weren't improvised materials, but traditional elements with established symbolics, significance, and practical effectiveness. The careful selection process wasn't maternal instinct, but learned methodology for genetic improvement through selective elimination. Joseph Jenkins' survival allowed network members to validate their selection criteria and monitor long-term outcomes. His exceptional intelligence, despite severe deformities, confirmed their belief in successful bloodline purification through ritualistic killing. The package delivered after his death completed ceremonial obligations that persisted 13 years, beyond the original ritual. Network commitment extended far beyond immediate infanticide to lifelong monitoring of survivors and final acknowledgement of their deaths. Such dedication proves religious conviction rather than mere eugenic practicality. Network members genuinely believed ritualistic practices served divine purpose that required proper completion, according to established protocols. The correspondence discovered in Thomas Jenkins' abandoned cabin provides unprecedented insight into distributed religious extremism in 19th century America. Letters reveal sophisticated theological framework for justifying coordinated infanticide as divine service. References to bloodline purification and sacred fire demonstrate how religious language can sanitize extreme practices while maintaining their essential character. Theological justification transforms murder into sacrifice without changing fundamental reality. The network's geographic distribution suggests successful adaptation to American frontier conditions. Isolated families maintained religious traditions that might have disappeared in more integrated social environments. But isolation also prevented exposure to moderating influences that might have reduced extreme practices through social pressure or legal intervention. Geographic separation enabled religious extremism that mainstream society would not tolerate. The balance between religious freedom and social protection becomes particularly complex when applied to isolated communities practicing harmful traditions. Legal intervention may be necessary to protect victims, but enforcement becomes difficult in remote locations. Mary Lou Jenkins' prosecution and execution demonstrate state capability to address extreme religious practices when brought to official attention. But detection and prosecution of distributed networks requires coordination and resources that 19th century law enforcement often lacked. The network's survival beyond Mary Lou's case proves that eliminating individual practitioners doesn't necessarily disrupt systematic practices maintained by organized communities. Distributed leadership and shared knowledge enable continued operation despite localized crackdowns. Contemporary law enforcement faces similar challenges when investigating distributed networks using modern communication technology. Internet-based coordination makes traditional geographic jurisdictions less relevant while enabling global reach for extremist groups. The fundamental challenge remains unchanged: how to balance religious freedom against protection of vulnerable individuals. The network's theological framework provided genuine religious justification for practices that harm children. Religious conviction doesn't diminish criminal responsibility, but it complicates law enforcement and judicial responses. Practitioners who genuinely believe they serve divine purpose may view legal prosecution as religious persecution rather than legitimate criminal justice. The 17 wooden slats represent this moral complexity in concrete form. To network practitioners, they were sacred ritual tools serving divine purpose. To law enforcement and mainstream society, they were evidence of systematic child abuse. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. The slats did serve ritual purpose within established religious framework. They also facilitated organized infanticide that caused immense suffering to helpless victims. Historical distance makes moral judgment seem simple. The network's practices were clearly wrong, regardless of religious justification. But contemporary societies face similar dilemmas when addressing harmful traditional practices defended as religious freedom. Female genital mutilation, forced marriage, honor violence, and medical neglect based on religious beliefs all presento. Similar challenges to legal systems attempting to balance religious liberty against individual protection. The network's correspondence reveals how intelligent, morally concerned individuals can justify extreme practices through religious framework. Letters show genuine wrestling with ethical implications, alongside firm commitment to theological principles. This historical example demonstrates that religious conviction alone doesn't determine moral behavior. The same theological commitment that justified ritualistic infanticide could potentially support beneficial practices if channeled differently. Religious communities possess tremendous capacity for both good and evil depending on how theological principles are interpreted and applied. The network's story shows how isolated communities can develop extreme interpretations that mainstream society would reject. But mainstream society also bears responsibility for conditions that enable religious extremism. Social isolation, economic hardship, and lack of educational opportunities create environments where extreme beliefs can flourish without external challenge. The Jenkins family's history of consanguineous marriage and genetic disorders created desperate circumstances that made extreme solutions seem reasonable. Better understanding of genetics and access to medical care might have prevented the conditions that led to ritualistic infanticide. Similarly, improved social integration and educational opportunities might have exposed network members to alternative perspectives that could have moderated their extreme beliefs without eliminating religious conviction entirely. The network's decline resulted from changing social conditions rather than direct intervention. Improved transportation, communication, and law enforcement gradually made extreme practices unsustainable rather than quickly eliminating them through targeted action. This pattern suggests that addressing religious extremism requires long-term social change rather than short-term law enforcement solutions. Sustainable prevention depends on creating conditions that make extreme beliefs less attractive rather than simply punishing extreme actions. Mary Lou Jenkins died on that gallows, in Yellville convinced of her righteousness. The network continued operating for decades after her execution. Law enforcement eliminated individual practitioners, but couldn't eliminate the conditions that made their practices seem necessary and justified. Contemporary efforts to address religious extremism might benefit from understanding these historical patterns. Prosecution alone doesn't eliminate belief systems that justify harmful practices. Sustainable change requires addressing underlying social conditions that enable extremism, but individual accountability remains important regardless of social factors. Mary Lou Jenkins chose to burn her infant son despite having alternatives. Network members chose to maintain harmful practices despite knowing they caused suffering. Religious. Justification doesn't eliminate moral responsibility even when practitioners genuinely believe they serve divine purpose. Society must protect vulnerable individuals from harmful practices while working to address conditions that enable religious extremism. The 17 wooden slats found in that Arkansas shed remind us that extreme beliefs can motivate extreme actions. Religious conviction provides powerful motivation for both beneficial and harmful behaviors. Understanding this historical example helps contemporary societies navigate similar challenges. The fundamental questions raised by the network's practices, genetic health, individual rights, religious freedom, social responsibility, remain relevant across centuries of technological and social change. Mary Lou Jenkins' story illuminates persistent moral complexities through specific historical detail. The ritual burning of her infant son represents systematic practices that continue in modified forms today. If everyone in Yellville knew about Thomas and Mary Lou's marriage, why did no one intervene before children were born? If the network's PION correspondence proves coordinated infanticide, why did law enforcement fail to prosecute other practitioners?